When you strip away the noise, the clips, and the recycled arguments, the conversation around ShedeurSanders becomes much simpler and much more revealing. This was never really about whether he could throw a football. It was about how the league chooses to define readiness, patience, and belief at the most difficult position in sports. The film doesn't tell a story of a finished product. It tells a story of a foundation, leadership that shows up under stress, processing that improved in real time, pocket presence that evolved instead of collapsing, and mistakes that, while costly, came with visible lessons attached. That combination matters more than any single stat ever could. History has seen this moment before. Quarterbacks who didn't look clean early, who tested patience, who made teams uncomfortable because they forced a decision, commit or walk away. Some organizations chose to invest, others hesitated, and years later those choices defined franchises. What makes this situation different is how clearly the crossroads has arrived. The traits that can't be taught already seem to be present. The ones that can be refined still need work. That's not a red flag, that's the job description for development. The real question is whether the environment will allow it to happen. Because talent alone doesn't decide careers, alignment does. Coaching belief, organizational patience, a willingness to live with growth instead of demanding perfection. Without those things, even the most gifted players stall. With them, imperfect prospects become pillars. It's also worth remembering how narratives work. Once a label sticks, it becomes self-reinforcing. Every mistake confirms it. Every improvement gets minimized. And before long, evaluation turns into expectation management instead of honest assessment. That's when teams stop seeing players and start seeing risk. ShedeurSanders sits right in the middle of that tension. This isn't about crowning him anything yet. It's about recognizing what's actually on the table. A quarterback with presence, resilience, and a visible learning curve. Someone who didn't fold when conditions were difficult and didn't retreat when criticism grew louder. That alone narrows the field more than people realize. So the question moving forward isn't whether Shedeur can succeed in the NFL. It's whether the league is willing to give development the same respect it gives potential, whether decision makers will trust film over fear, growth over optics, process over panic. Because if they don't, this won't be the first time a quarterback was misjudged at the exact moment it mattered most. And history has a way of remembering those moments. If you enjoyed this breakdown and want to stay locked in on all the latest NFL drama, make sure you hit that like button. It helps the video reach more people who love this content just like you. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another update, reaction, or storyline as it unfolds in real time. I also want to hear from you in the comments. What do you think about ShedeurSanders' performance and the Browns' collapse? Drop your thoughts below and let's talk about it. And don't forget to share this video with friends who follow the NFL. Your support truly keeps the channel moving forward. There's one question that keeps hovering over every conversation about ShedeurSanders, and almost no one wants to address it directly. Not because it's complicated, but because it exposes how broken the discussion around quarterbacks has become. The question isn't whether Shedeur has talent. It isn't whether he's made mistakes. The real question is much simpler and far more uncomfortable. What are we actually evaluating when we judge a young quarterback? Because if the answer is stats alone, then history tells us that some of the league's biggest success stories should have never happened. Plenty of quarterbacks looked messy early. Plenty threw picks, struggled with pressure, and looked overwhelmed before everything clicked. But when it comes to Shedeur, the patience seems gone almost instantly. The conversation skips steps. One bad stretch turns into a verdict. One rough clip becomes an identity. And suddenly, development is treated like an excuse instead of a process. That's where things start to feel off. When people criticize Shedeur, the arguments sound familiar. He holds the ball too long. He forces throws. He needs to clean things up. All of that can be true and still completely miss the point, because those are correctable issues, mechanical issues, experience issues. The kind of things that get refined with reps, coaching, and stability. But here's what rarely gets discussed. Very few people stop to ask whether he actually understands the game at a high level, whether he commands the huddle, whether teammates respond to him when things go sideways, whether he processes information quickly enough to survive on Sundays. Those are the traits that separate quarterbacks who stick around from those who disappear. And that silence is telling. There's also an unspoken factor that shapes this entire debate. Image. Shedeur doesn't carry himself like a placeholder. He doesn't sound unsure. He doesn't shrink under attention. For some people, that confidence reads as arrogance. For others, it reads as leadership. But instead of unpacking that difference, the conversation usually skips straight to judgment. It's easier to critique confidence than to evaluate command. Another thing nobody likes to admit is how much expectations distort reality. When a quarterback is supposed to be ready now, every flaw feels unacceptable. Development windows close faster. Leeway disappears. And instead of being compared to other rookies, he's compared to an ideal that almost no one actually meets. That's especially true when the noise around a player is louder than the evidence. What makes this situation even stranger is that the league itself doesn't seem aligned. Public comments feel cautious, non-committal, carefully worded. But behind closed doors, it's been said that opinions vary far more than people realize. Some see risk. Others see raw material worth betting on. And that divide explains why the conversation feels so fragmented. So the question everyone keeps dodging isn't about whether ShedeurSanders is perfect. It's whether the evaluation process itself is honest. Are people reacting to what they see on film or to the narrative they've already accepted? Because once you ask that question, everything about this debate starts to shift. The entire conversation shifted the moment someone finally slowed things down and looked past the noise. Not a commentator, not a hot take artist, but a coach who spent years doing the unglamorous work of teaching quarterbacks how to survive when things aren't perfect. Instead of debating ShedeurSanders from a distance, he went straight to the tape, and that decision changed everything. This wasn't a casual watch-through. Reports suggest this breakdown came from hours of detailed film study, focusing on the things that never show up in box scores. Footwork under pressure, eye discipline, how a quarterback reacts when the first read isn't there, and most importantly, whether improvement shows up over time or stays stuck in the same place. That's the difference between a prospect and a project. What makes this evaluation hit differently is who it came from. A coach with decades around the game. Someone who's seen young quarterbacks struggle, adapt, and either rise or fall apart. He wasn't looking to prove a point or defend a narrative. He was trying to answer a simple question that front offices care about more than fans realize. Can this player be developed, or is he already maxed out? And the answer he found wasn't what many expected. According to the breakdown, Shedeur's tape didn't tell the story of a quarterback spiraling. It told the story of one adjusting. Early snaps showed exactly what critics point to: rushed decisions, unsettled feet, moments where the game looked fast. But instead of repeating those mistakes week after week, the film showed changes. Subtle ones. Smarter pocket movement. Quicker identification of coverage. Better timing as reps piled up. That kind of progression matters. A lot. The most revealing part of the breakdown wasn't a single throw or highlight. It was the pattern. When pressure came early, Shedeur didn't panic the same way later in the season. When defenses disguised looks, he started responding instead of reacting. That's not luck. That's processing. And processing is one of the hardest things to teach at the professional level. There was also a clear emphasis on leadership traits that don't get clipped for social media. How he communicated pre-snap. How he handled missed opportunities. How the offense looked when momentum shifted. Film doesn't just show plays, it shows presence. And that presence was consistent, even when the circumstances were. Now, to be clear, this breakdown didn't ignore flaws. Mistakes were called out. Poor decisions were labeled as such. But what stood out was the framing. These weren't fatal issues. They were developmental ones. The kind that separate rookies from second-year quarterbacks who take real leaps. And that's why this film study landed differently. It didn't argue that ShedeurSanders is finished or flawless. It argued something far more disruptive, that the foundation is already in place. And once that idea enters the conversation, the entire narrative starts to unravel. There's one trait every team searches for, talks around, and rarely finds, and it's the one thing no amount of coaching can manufacture. You either walk into the league with it, or you don't. Arm strength can be improved. Footwork can be cleaned up. Decision-making can be sharpened with reps. But this trait sits deeper than mechanics, and it's why certain quarterbacks survive chaos while others fade the moment pressure hits. It's leadership, real leadership, not the performative kind, not the scripted press conferences or viral speeches. The kind that shows up when the play breaks down, when the protection fails, and when the margin for error disappears. And this is where the conversation around ShedeurSanders quietly changes. According to those who have studied the film closely, this trait shows up consistently. Not just in big moments, but in the in-between snaps that most people overlook. How he carries himself after mistakes, how quickly he resets, how teammates respond when things aren't going well. These details don't flash on a stat sheet, but they matter more than almost anything else at the quarterback position. What separates leadership from confidence is impact. Confidence is internal. Impact is contagious. And reports suggest that when Shedeur was on the field, the offense played differently. Not perfectly, not mistake-free, but with purpose. There was energy, belief, a sense that the group trusted the person directing traffic, even when the situation wasn't ideal. That's not something you install in a playbook. This is also where comparisons start to make people uneasy. Because historically, quarterbacks who eventually became elite were often praised early for this exact quality, long before the results fully matched. They weren't finished products. They were stabilizers, players who kept teams afloat while the rest of the structure caught up. And that's a dangerous archetype to overlook. What makes this trait even more valuable is how rare it is under pressure. Many young quarterbacks look composed when things are clean. Very few do when they're constantly under duress, when protection breaks down, when expectations weigh heavier than development. Yet this is where Shedeur's presence reportedly stood out most. There's also an important distinction that often gets lost. Leadership doesn't mean being the loudest voice. It means being the most trusted one. Film shows how often Shedeur took ownership of situations, both good and bad. How he communicated adjustments. How he stayed engaged, even when momentum swung the wrong way. That steadiness is what coaches value more than flair. And here's the uncomfortable truth for the league. This trait is usually the hardest one to find and the easiest one to underestimate, especially when it comes from a player who already attracts attention for other reasons. It's easier to question mechanics than to acknowledge command. Because once you admit a quarterback has this foundation, the evaluation changes. You're no longer asking whether he belongs. You're asking how much he can grow. And that's why this trait matters so much. Because while almost everything else can be fixed, refined, or coached up, leadership at this level is something the NFL can't teach, and it might already be there. The most misleading thing about the way ShedeurSanders has been discussed is the idea that nothing changed. That the same mistakes kept repeating, that the same flaws kept showing up, and that whatever you saw early in the season was exactly who he was the entire time. That assumption sounds confident, but it doesn't hold up once you actually look at the progression. Because the growth was there, it just wasn't loud. Early on, the game clearly looked fast. Defensive looks shifted late. Pressure arrived quicker than expected. Footwork got rushed, and decisions followed. Those are the clips that made the rounds, the ones that fueled the narrative. But what rarely gets mentioned is what happened after those moments, how he responded the following weeks, and whether the same errors showed up again. According to film evaluations, they didn't, not in the same way. As reps piled up, there was a noticeable change in how Shedeur handled the pocket. Instead of drifting backward when pressure showed, he began stepping up. Instead of abandoning structure too quickly, he stayed square and kept his eyes downfield. Those adjustments sound minor, but at the NFL level, they're everything. A half step forward can be the difference between a sack, a throwaway, or a completion. processing showed similar growth. Early reads were sometimes late. Coverages disguised post-snap caused hesitation. But over time, those hesitations shortened. He started identifying pressure faster. He began recognizing leverage pre-snap and confirming it after the ball was snapped. That's not instinct alone, that's learning in real time. One of the biggest indicators of development is repetition without regression. Young quarterbacks often bounce between good and bad habits. What stood out here was that once certain improvements showed up, they tended to stick. Footwork got cleaner. Timing improved. The ball came out quicker on rhythm concepts. Those aren't coincidence, they're evidence. It's also worth noting the environment this growth happened in. Protection issues didn't suddenly disappear. The margin for error remained slim, and yet the composure improved. That matters because it shows adaptability, not comfort. Growth under ideal conditions is expected. Growth under stress is revealing. Mistakes still happened, and that's important to acknowledge. There were throws he'd want back, decisions that came a beat too late, but the nature of the mistakes changed. They became situational rather than systemic, isolated rather than constant. That distinction often gets lost when narratives flatten everything into a single storyline. What this suggests is something many people overlook. Development isn't linear, but it is traceable. And when you trace Shedeur's snaps from early to late, the arc bends in the right direction. The tools weren't just present, they were being sharpened. And that's why this growth matters so much. Because if improvement is already showing up without stability, structure, or ideal conditions, it raises a much bigger question about what happens next. There's one number that gets thrown into every debate about ShedeurSanders, usually as a conversation ender. It shows up in headlines, graphics, and arguments as if it tells the whole story by itself. Interceptions. Say the number out loud, and for some people, that's enough to make a decision. But this is where context matters more than volume. Interceptions don't all come from the same place. Some come from bad reads, some come from late throws. Others come from pressure that arrives before a play has a chance to breathe. When those situations get lumped together, the stat stops informing and starts misleading. And that's exactly what's happened here. Film reviews suggest that many of Shedeur's interceptions weren't the result of reckless quarterbacking. They came from specific, identifiable issues. Unsettled footwork early in the season, drifting in the pocket instead of stepping up, trying to compensate when protection broke down too quickly. None of those are excuses, but all of them are fixable. What's rarely mentioned is how those mistakes evolved. Early interceptions tended to come from mechanical breakdowns. Later ones came from situational judgment. That distinction matters because it shows a quarterback learning where the line is, not blindly repeating the same errors. Growth doesn't mean mistakes vanish. It means the reasons behind them change. There's also the pressure factor. Reports indicate Shedeur faced consistent heat, often earlier than designed. When a quarterback is forced to make decisions before routes fully develop, risk increases. That's not speculation. That's how defenses are built. And while elite quarterbacks eventually learn to navigate that chaos, expecting perfection from a rookie under constant duress isn't realistic. Some analysts have pointed out another uncomfortable truth. Aggressive quarterbacks tend to throw more interceptions early, especially those asked to push the ball downfield rather than manage games conservatively. Risk is part of that role. The question isn't whether interceptions happened, it's whether the quarterback learned from them. Film suggests he did. The timing improved, the footwork stabilized, the decision speed increased. Those adjustments don't erase the stat, but they explain it. And explanation matters when projecting forward instead of judging backward. What makes this stat even more dangerous is how easily it becomes a shortcut. Instead of evaluating the full picture, it allows people to stop thinking, to label, to dismiss. And that's rarely how teams with long-term success operate. The truth is, interceptions tell you what happened, not why it happened, and not what happens next. When you focus only on the number, you miss the trajectory. And trajectory is what separates a quarterback who stalls out from one who takes a leap. That's why this stat keeps getting used against him. not because it's definitive, but because it's convenient. What's happening behind closed doors doesn't always match what gets said publicly, and that gap feels especially wide when it comes to ShedeurSanders. From the outside, it can seem like the league has reached some quiet consensus. The tone is cautious. The language is vague. Nobody fully commits one way or the other, but that surface-level calm hides something far more interesting. Because it's been said that opinions inside front offices aren't nearly as aligned as they appear. Publicly, teams tend to speak the same language when uncertainty exists. They hedge. They wait. They avoid staking positions that could age poorly. That's especially true at quarterback, where one wrong call can cost jobs. So instead of hearing strong endorsements or harsh dismissals, you hear phrases that keep options open. But reports suggest that internally, the debate around Shedeur is far more divided. On one side are evaluators who focus on development curves. They look at leadership traits, processing improvement, and how a quarterback responds under stress. For them, the question isn't whether he's finished, it's whether the foundation is strong enough to build on. And based on film, some believe it is. On the other side are decision-makers who prioritize immediate returns. They worry about optics, about turnovers, about public pressure, about whether patience will exist long enough for growth to matter. From that perspective, any risk feels amplified, especially when a player already draws attention. That split creates paralysis. There's also a coaching element that complicates things further. It's been suggested that certain coaching staffs value quarterbacks who can command rooms and adapt quickly, even if execution isn't perfect yet. Others prefer clean, low-variance profiles that feel safer on paper. Shedeur doesn't neatly fit into the latter category, and that makes evaluations more subjective than comfortable. Another factor is timing. Some teams simply aren't positioned to develop a quarterback right now. They need stability, not projects. Others are in transition, new systems, new leadership, new timelines. For those teams, a developmental upside play becomes more appealing. That context changes how the same film gets interpreted. There's also the reality of perception. Once a narrative takes hold publicly, it affects how decisions are judged. Even if a front office believes in the upside, they know the scrutiny will be louder. Mistakes will be magnified. Patience will be questioned. And not every organization is willing to absorb that pressure. So instead of clarity, you get quiet disagreement. That's why the messaging feels so careful. Why no one rushes to declare him either the future or a failure. Because behind the scenes, there's no unanimous answer. Just competing philosophies, risk tolerance, and timelines. And when a league can't agree on how to evaluate a quarterback, hesitation follows. Not because there's no belief, but because belief comes with consequences. That's the real divide no one talks about. When you strip away the noise, the clips, and the recycled arguments, the conversation around ShedeurSanders becomes much simpler and much more revealing. This was never really about whether he could throw a football. It was about how the league chooses to define readiness, patience, and belief at the most difficult position in sports. The film doesn't tell a story of a finished product. It tells a story of a foundation, leadership that shows up under stress, processing that improved in real time, pocket presence that evolved instead of collapsing, and mistakes that, while costly, came with visible lessons attached. That combination matters more than any single stat ever could. History has seen this moment before. Quarterbacks who didn't look clean early, who tested patience, who made teams uncomfortable because they forced a decision, commit or walk away. Some organizations chose to invest, others hesitated, and years later those choices defined franchises. What makes this situation different is how clearly the crossroads has arrived. The traits that can't be taught already seem to be present. The ones that can be refined still need work. That's not a red flag, that's the job description for development. The real question is whether the environment will allow it to happen. Because talent alone doesn't decide careers, alignment does. Coaching belief, organizational patience, a willingness to live with growth instead of demanding perfection. Without those things, even the most gifted players stall. With them, imperfect prospects become pillars. It's also worth remembering how narratives work. Once a label sticks, it becomes self-reinforcing. Every mistake confirms it. Every improvement gets minimized. And before long, evaluation turns into expectation management instead of honest assessment. That's when teams stop seeing players and start seeing risk. ShedeurSanders sits right in the middle of that tension. This isn't about crowning him anything yet. It's about recognizing what's actually on the table. A quarterback with presence, resilience, and a visible learning curve. Someone who didn't fold when conditions were difficult and didn't retreat when criticism grew louder. That alone narrows the field more than people realize. So the question moving forward isn't whether Shedeur can succeed in the NFL. It's whether the league is willing to give development the same respect it gives potential, whether decision makers will trust film over fear, growth over optics, process over panic. Because if they don't, this won't be the first time a quarterback was misjudged at the exact moment it mattered most. And history has a way of remembering those moments.
If you enjoyed today's breakdown and want to keep up with all the drama, trades, and behind-the-scenes action in the NFL, then don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps this channel grow and lets us know you love this kind of content. And hey, don't keep it to yourself. Share this video with your friends, your group chats, or anyone who loves football as much as you do. The more the conversation spreads, the better it gets. Most importantly, if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to the channel and tap the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss when we drop fresh stories, wild rumors, or breaking updates that the mainstream media won't talk about.